Hi, I'm Peter Donica, and today I'm going to be talking about scaling in granular systems. First thing we need to understand about scaling in granular systems is that we have different flow regimes. The first flow regime is the quasi-static regime. This is where the particles are just on the point of incipient motion. They're all packed together, we apply a force to them, and they start to move. And this is the kind of flow we get in soil mechanics and also in hoppers. The second type of flow is the inertial or dense granular flow regime. This is where the particles have begun to move. They are moving, they've got some velocity, and therefore they're dilated. And this is the sort of flow that we get in transfer chutes. And then the third type of flow regime is the dilute flow regime, where the particles have moved further apart and they've got a high velocity, they're bouncing off each other, behaving like a gas, and this is what we get in fluid beds. So the theory for the quasi-static flow regime was developed by a guy called Andrew Jaenicke back in the 1960s, and he developed the shear cell, which is well known around the place for tests done by people like Tunra, and in fact Jaenicke and Johansen, the company. Johansen was a student of Jaenicke's. I think most people are familiar with this. And in his paper in 1964, Jaenicke gave some riders about the limitations of the theory that he developed. And here is an actual clip from his paper back in 1964, and he says, "For these equations to be applicable, the dynamic forces must be negligible compared to the gravitational forces." Dynamic forces, negligible compared to gravitational forces. We need to remember that. When it comes to the inertial flow regime, this was the theory for this was developed by a guy called Ralph Banyold. A very interesting guy with a passion for sand dunes. He ran the long-range desert group during the Second World War, did espionage behind enemy lines, drove across the sand dunes in very old cars, two-wheel drive cars with the tyres let down. After the war he did some experiments. One of a simple experimental setup he started out with was just a channel with an inclined channel with a gate at the top and a hopper, and he let sand flow down that channel. And he developed some correlations for that. He went on to do a lot more sophisticated work, and his flow down a channel experiment has been repeated by countless experimenters since, and they've all come up with similar correlations to his. You won't find Banyold mentioned in the literature in Australia for some reason, but he's very certainly a pivotal figure in the relevant theory for transfer chutes, the inertial flow regime. The other concept we need to understand is dimensional similarity. This is an important concept for what we do at bulk solids modelling. So in dimensional similarity, we keep the system parameters, we express the system parameters as dimensionless numbers. And then we hold those dimensionless numbers constant as we scale the system. The classic example of that is the Reynolds number. Most people will be familiar with the Reynolds number. That's the expression for it there. And the Reynolds number is the ratio of the inertial to viscous forces. So dimensionless numbers express the ratio of the major forces in the system. So Reynolds number, inertial to viscous forces. Dimensionless numbers are independent of scale, and they're also independent, importantly, of the fluid or the medium that we're using. So here's a picture of somebody testing a model of a submarine. This is actually NASA, in fact, and they're testing it in a wind tunnel. It doesn't matter that it's not in water. As long as the relevant dimensionless numbers are kept constant, you can use whatever fluid suits. So let's look at the forces in granular flows. There are three main forces. There's the inertial force due to the motion, gravitational force due to gravity. There's the cohesive forces, co meaning together, so that's the forces holding the particles together, and the adhesive forces that hold the particles onto other surfaces. So using those forces we can define some dimensionless numbers. And the first and primary one is the ratio of the inertial to gravitational forces, and that's known as the Froude number. And that you find that in all sorts of granular flows. The Froude number pops up all the time. Notice that that's just inertial and gravitational forces. We're not dealing with cohesive forces in that case. If we bring in cohesion, the cohesive force, we can define a ratio, the cohesive to the gravitational force, and that's been coined the granular bond number. And physically that's equal to the number of particles that can be suspended in a vertical chain, just by the cohesive forces between them. Now that number can be defined if we've got a system of perfect spheres. Here is a system of perfect spheres. It's a child's toy. And these particles are all held together with cohesive forces with some sort of polymer. And we can make a little chain, and I've tried to see how many of these I can stick together. I think this material's got a bond number of something like 20 perhaps. So that's the cohesive forces. The adhesive forces are what hold it onto the screen. Now we can define the bond number for a system like this quite easily. It's nice perfect spheres. If we've got a system with a wide range of size distributions, as you do in iron ore for example, you can't really define a granular bond number because you've got particles in there that just go down to nanometer scale. So the only thing we can really do is we know that at certain bond numbers certain things start to happen. As we increase the bond number we start to get the material in an iron ore situation lumping together. And the higher the granular bond number goes, the bigger the clusters of particles become. So what we attempt to do, we can't really define numerically what the bond number is. So what we try to do is run through a range of cohesions that takes us through the range of bond numbers that give us the same physical effects that we see in the real world. And those effects are things like the material breaking into three as it goes across a head pulley, the formation of rhino horns, the clusters that you see whenever you take a photograph or a video of material going over a head pulley, you'll notice it always breaks up into clusters. So we see those same effects here in our models. And then lastly we've got the adhesive force. There's not even a number for this. You know, we're getting increasingly complex. It's easy to deal with just inertial and gravitational forces. If we bring in cohesive forces, it becomes more difficult. We bring in adhesive forces, it just gets even more difficult. And there's not even a number to describe this. But this is the ratio of the inertial to adhesive forces affects things like carryback on conveyor belts. So we can control the Froude number. We try to run through the range of bond numbers, and in terms of adhesion in the system, there's not a lot we can do. So let's look at the Froude number. That's a picture of William Froude. He and his son towed boats up and down a river somewhere in England in the 1860s, I think it was. And he was interested in the resistance of various hull shapes to the flow in water. And he developed this number, so that's the square of the velocity divided by characteristic length, and g, the gravitational constant. The important thing to notice about the Froude number is there's no density term in there. So it's independent of density. It's applicable to non-cohesive systems. We can't have cohesion if we're just using Froude number scaling. And this was the theory that I first used back in 1992 when I first started doing scale modelling. That's me, picture of me in the lab at Rio Tinto in 1992 with the first conveyor loop that I developed. So this idea, this point that this Froude number is independent of density is something that people find hard to grasp. Whenever people look at scale modelling, they think, oh, haven't you got to match the density? And in fact, I see specifications written where they say thou shalt match the density between the scale model and the real world. It's just wrong, it's nonsense. And here's a simple example. The simplest example of Froude number scaling is flow through an orifice, such as happens at the bottom of a hopper. I've got a simple little demonstration I'll do here. I've got here some sago and some lead shot. They've got a density difference of 10. And I'm going to flow them through an orifice. And let's look at what happens. You can see that even though there is a density difference of 10, very little difference in the flow. Almost exactly the same. So density difference of 10 doesn't make any difference to the flow. So that's the first point we need to understand. Now let's look at cohesive forces in granular systems. We've got two basic cohesive forces. We've got the van der Waals force, which is due to molecular interactions at the surface of particles. And we've got capillary forces due to the liquid, to the water in the system. And we can calculate these forces. There's formulas for calculating these for perfect systems. And I've done this for a perfect system as a function of particle size, and I've graphed it here. We've got the two lines. We can see that the particle size is around 3 millimetres. So the vertical axis is the ratio of the cohesion to the gravitational force. So at particle sizes around 3 millimetres, we've got virtually no cohesive forces in the system. They're irrelevant. As the particle size goes down, we get down below about 0.5 millimetre, the cohesive forces skyrocket. So it's a highly non-linear system. So what are the consequences of that? Well, another thing that people believe is that we need to scale down. If we're doing scale modelling, we need to take the actual material that we're considering and crush it down and make a scale model of that material at the appropriate scale. So let's look what happens. We've got some iron ore fines. Here's a size distribution I've just put together. It's a bell-shaped distribution. Got a top size of 6 millimetres and it goes down to nothing. So that could be an iron ore fines size distribution. What happens if we try to scale that down by a factor of 10? We end up with this size distribution here, the red curve. And we can see that the entire size distribution has now been pushed down into the cohesive range, all down in the 0.5 millimetre or less range. So that instead of, we're scaling down the system, we're scaling down the gravitational forces to 1/10 and the inertial forces to 1/10. If we do this, we're actually scaling up the cohesive forces by an enormous amount. And so the result is, if you actually, in practice, if you try to do this, the material just all agglomerates and you end up with some random size distribution that's got nothing to do with anything. So, you know, let's forget about trying to scale down the particle size distribution. And in fact, Johansen wrote a paper in 1972 where he discusses these things for the case of modelling in the quasi-static regime, and he comes to the same conclusion. Another thing that people think is, oh, we've got to keep the moisture content the same as what we're considering in the real world. Well, no, moisture content's not a scalable quantity either. And just to demonstrate that, here's a picture of some iron ore. That's 3 to 5 millimetre iron ore at 13% moisture. And there's some minus 150 micron iron ore at the same moisture. This one's a free-flowing solid, this one's a brick. So moisture doesn't scale. So given those things, we're not going to try and match the density, we're not going to scale the size distribution, we're not going to try and scale the moisture. What do we do? What do we use? So we need to select a material suitable for testing. So we want something that duplicates the essential behaviours. We'd like it to be a low density material, an easy to deal with material. We don't want it to agglomerate. We need to use a material that doesn't agglomerate, otherwise we've got no control over what's happening. We need to be able to control the cohesion. We can do this in the case of our materials by changing the moisture content. We can change it up and down without any hysteresis, and we can get very good control, and we can measure the moisture level. We want the properties to be constant over time. We want them to be non-polluting, biodegradable, so we can throw the stuff away without any problems. Resistant to water, because we're going to use water in the system, so we don't want it to react with water. Here's a little bit of history now. Here's the first predictive scale model. This was a bauxite, a washed bauxite chute at Comalco. This was done in 1995 in the Rio Tinto labs. And I want to emphasise that this was the first time this technology was used. It did not exist before this point. So here's a chute. We were given the drawings of this chute before they built it. We modelled it. The material used to model it is cracked wheat. Doesn't match the density, doesn't match the sizing. It's a non-cohesive material. Fruit number scaling. We got a perfect match between the model and the chute when it was finally built. This is a stacker chute. Just a couple of things about BSM. We established BSM in 1997. First used sawdust media for a job at Hammersley Iron Marandoo in 2001. So I've been using it for a long time. Built the facility at Yeagerup in 2006. We modelled the entire Vale S11D project over a period of years, right from the truckless mining, right through the overland conveyors and the process plant. There's a conference on handling sticky ores where I just talk about a lot of the theory that I've outlined here. That's available online on my LinkedIn profile and in other places. And another thing I mentioned, we just got ISO 9001 accreditation in the last 6 months. Thanks for listening.